After my millionaire grandfather died and left me everything. My parents, who'd ignored me all my life, tried to sue me for the money. I walked in. Mom sneered. Judge froze. The air in the Midtown boardroom was so cold it felt like a physical weight. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. A place that should have felt like a victory, but instead felt like an interrogation. Across from me sat Karen and Mark, my mother and father. They weren't looking at me with grief. They were looking at me with a pure, unadulterated rage. Karen, my mother, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. Let's be perfectly clear, she said, her eyes like ice. He was senile. And you are a thief. To understand the accusation, you have to go back 30 years. I wasn't really their daughter. I was their burden. A 6-month-old inconvenience left at my grandparents' Upper West Side brownstone. Karen was 19. A debutante without a debut. Mark was 20. A self-proclaimed startup guru who was, then and always, just about to close his first round of funding. They were going to California to find investors and left me with my grandparents, Arthur and Eleanor, for just a few weeks. They never came back. Not really. My grandparents raised me. Arthur, the founder of one of the most respected publishing houses in New York, and Eleanor, his brilliant editor-in-chief. They were my constants. They were the ones who attended parent-teacher conferences, who taught me how to ride a bike in Central Park, who read manuscripts to me instead of fairy tales. My parents' visits were rare, transactional. They'd appear twice a year, smelling of expensive perfume and desperation, always needing something. A bridge loan for one of Mark's phantom companies, a small advance on Karen's non-existent inheritance, and my grandfather, Arthur, always gave it to them. For 30 years. He sent them a check every single month. It started at a few thousand and ballooned over time. I did the math later. Over $1.6 million. $1.6 million to stay away. But here's what I learned. What Arthur taught me to see. My mother wasn't just greedy. She was a professional victim. In her mind, that $1.6 million wasn't a gift. It was a payment. It was the bare minimum compensation for the glamorous, brilliant life she believed my grandfather had stolen from her by forcing her to have me. She wasn't grateful for the money, she felt entitled to it. She deserved it. And my father? Mark was the black hole that money disappeared into. A new .com. A revolutionary app. A fintech solution. Always a new idea. Always a new failure. While they were cashing checks, I was growing up in Arthur's library. He didn't just give me a home, he gave me a purpose. He'd hand me a raw manuscript and say, "Tell me what's wrong with the third act. Nancy, find the lie." He taught me to spot insincerity, to cut through the fluff and find the factual, structural truth underneath. He trained me to be a journalist, an investigator. He just didn't know he was also training me to one day investigate him. And them? My whole life. I was the price of admission. I was the inconvenient, quiet daughter they had to tolerate in order to maintain their access to Arthur's bank account. And now, Arthur was gone. The bank was closed. And they were looking at me. Finally seeing me. Not as their daughter, but as the locked vault they needed a key for. I went to Columbia for journalism. Graduated top of my class. My parents, Karen and Mark, didn't come to the ceremony. They said the drive into the city was a nightmare that day. Arthur was there. Front row. In his best suit. Beaming. He held up a copy of the New York Times and mouthed, "You'll be in here one day. Nancy, you find the truth." He was my true North Sousers. My anchor. My entire family. 6 weeks ago, I found him. He had passed peacefully in his sleep. Slumped over his desk in that library. A final manuscript still open in his hands. That night, after the coroner had left, after the house fell silent, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into his library alone. Module E3, the empty room moment. It was the first time I'd ever been in that room without him. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he kept in a jar but rarely smoked. I ran my hand over the spines of the first editions he loved. His name embossed in gold on the leather. I walked over to his desk and sat in his worn leather chair, the one that was perfectly molded to the shape of his body after 50 years of reading. I picked up the cold, empty pipe from his desk tray. I looked at a framed photo on the corner of his desk, a picture of me, aged 10, missing my 2 front teeth, sitting on his shoulders in front of the publishing house. And in that moment, in that profound, crushing silence, I realized what was coming. I knew my parents. I knew what this empty chair represented to them. It wasn't a loss, it was an opportunity. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the strength for what I knew was next. I wasn't just grieving a man. I was grieving the end of peace. And I made a promise to that empty room. This wasn't about the money. This was about his legacy. They would not be allowed to burn it all down just to cash in the insurance. I would not let them. The will reading was held a week later. Not in the brownstone, but in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at the publishing house. David Chen, Arthur's oldest friend and most trusted editor, sat at the head of the table. He was the executor. He looked tired, his eyes still red. Karen and Mark sat opposite me. They were performing grief perfectly. Karen wore a conservative black dress, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. Mark just stared at the table, trying to look somber and responsible. They both looked at me with a sort of pitying disdain, as if I were the help. David cleared his throat and began to read. The will was short. Arthur was a brilliant editor, and he despised wasted words. He left a few specific bequests to longtime staff. He left a donation to the university. And then David got to the main part. As to the remainder of my estate, David read, his voice steady, comprising the brownstone residence on the Upper West Side. My personal investment portfolio of approximately $6 million. And, most importantly, my full controlling interest in this publishing house. I heard Karen suck in a breath. This was it. David continued. I leave it all, entirely and without condition, to my granddaughter, Nancy. The silence in the room was absolute. For about 3 seconds. Then the performance ended. What Karen's voice wasn't a whisper. It was a shriek. The tissue vanished. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. That's impossible. Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He was senile. You can't be serious. David. He was an old, confused man. On the contrary, Mark, David said, not flinching. He was perfectly lucid when he signed this 2 months ago. He also included a specific addendum explaining his reasoning. Karen laughed. A high, hysterical sound. What reasoning? David looked down at the paper and read the single line Arthur had left. Because, he read, Nancy was the only one who ever actually showed up. That one sentence broke them. It was the truth. And they couldn't stand it. She manipulated him, Karen screamed, pointing a finger at me. I hadn't said a word. She got into his head, she poisoned him against his own family. This is an outrage, Mark shouted, slamming his fist on the table. We will not let this stand. This is our legacy, not hers. We're his children. You're not, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. Karen's head snapped toward me. What did you say? You're not his children. I repeated, standing up. You're his disappointed investors. And the dividends just stopped. Mark's face turned purple. You'll regret this. Nancy. We will fight this. We're calling an emergency shareholder meeting. The bylaws have a competency clause. We'll prove he was senile. And we'll prove you are unfit to run this company. We will have you thrown out in a week. He grabbed Karen by the arm. "We're done here." They stormed out of the room, leaving a vacuum in their wake. David Chen just looked at me. He knew this would happen. He was trying to protect you. "Nancy." I nodded, looking out the window at the New York skyline. The war had officially been declared. They just made one fatal error. They thought they were fighting a grieving girl. They didn't realize they were fighting a journalist who had just been handed the biggest investigation of her life. My parents didn't wait. The very next day, the whispering campaign began. I started getting calls, forwarded emails. The board members were suddenly concerned. Industry gossip columns were lit up with anonymous tips. Arthur was a legend. But he just wasn't himself these last few years. The stories read, "The new leadership is questionable." They were painting a picture. Arthur was a senile old fool, and I was the manipulative, incompetent brat trying to liquidate his legacy for a quick payday. They were trying to build a narrative of incompetence. They forgot I was a master of narratives. I didn't get angry. I got organized. I went to David Chen's office. "They say he was incompetent for the last 5 years." I said, "I need everything. Every piece of paper he signed, every deal he made, every email he sent." David gave me full access to the archives. For 3 days, I didn't sleep. I locked myself in Arthur's library, my library, and I built a timeline. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was investigating. I found stock trades he'd made 8 months ago that had yielded a 20% return. I found handwritten notes on manuscripts from 6 months ago that were sharper than any editor half his age. I found a scathing, brilliant letter he'd written to a rival publisher just 3 months before he died. He wasn't incompetent. He was a lion until the very end. I had my proof. But the journalist in me knew the story wasn't finished. Something was missing. I turned to the bank statements. I had to understand the money. I tracked the $1.6 million he'd given them over 30 years. I saw the checks, month after month, like clockwork. And then, exactly 3 years ago, they stopped. Just gone. The monthly transfers from the publishing house account to Karen's bank account vanished. I sat back in the leather chair. That didn't make sense. If he'd cut them off 3 years ago, why hadn't they exploded then? Why had they continued to visit? All smiles and fake concern. Right up until his death, their lifestyle hadn't changed. The new cars, the business trips. Where was the money coming from? I stopped looking at the business accounts. I pulled Arthur's personal checking statements. The one he used for groceries, for his club memberships, for the house. And that's when I found it. It wasn't a monthly transfer. It was a series of checks. 12 of them, spread out over the last 3 years. Each one was for exactly $20,000. Total $240,000. I clicked on the image file for the first check. My stomach tightened. I clicked on the second, the third, the 12th. The signature, it was close. It was Arthur's name. But it was wrong. The A was too looping. The R was too sharp. It was the signature of someone trying to look like an old man. It wasn't the firm, confident hand I'd seen on 1,000 documents. Even in his last few months. It was a forgery. A clumsy, arrogant forgery. I sat there, the glow of the monitor lighting up the dark library. And the entire story snapped into focus. They hadn't just been ungrateful. They hadn't just been manipulative. They were criminals. He had cut them off. And they had decided to pay themselves. They had stolen from him. The boardroom meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was a crime scene. And I was holding the murder weapon. Which brings us back to that cold, mahogany table in the boardroom. The air was thick with tension. My parents' lawyer, a slick man in a $1,000 suit, had just finished his closing statement for their case. He'd used a lot of words like cognitive decline, undue influence, and familial duty. He painted a masterful picture of a dotard, a vulnerable old man being preyed upon by a cold, calculating granddaughter. He sat down. The board members, All men and women in their 60s who had known Arthur for decades looked uncomfortable. They looked at me with suspicion. Then, Karen stood up. The transformation was breathtaking. The ice queen from the hallway, the screaming woman from the will reading, was gone. In her place was the grieving daughter. She walked to the head of the table, not like a predator, but like a mourner. She placed her hands on the back of Arthur's empty chair. Her shoulders began to shake. "My father," she began, her voice cracking perfectly, "was my whole world." I almost laughed. It was a masterpiece. She turned to the board, her eyes welling with tears she clearly must have practiced. "He was a lion. We all know that. But in these last few years, he was tired. He was lonely." She took a shaky breath and looked at me. Not with anger, but with a profound, theatrical sadness. "I tried to be there," she whispered, dabbing her eye with a tissue she'd brought precisely for this moment. "Mark and I, we tried to help. We tried to warn him. But Nancy." She got in his ear. She twisted things. She told him we were just after his money. She let that hang in the air. The irony was so thick, I could barely breathe. She poisoned him against us. Karen's voice grew stronger, filled with righteous indignation. His own family. She preyed on his grief after my mother, Eleanor, passed. And now, she walked over to the large window, looking out over the city. Now, this child wants to liquidate his legacy. She has no idea what it takes to run this company. She wants to sell it off, piece by piece, to fund her journalistic fantasies. She turned back, her face a mask of noble suffering. "We are not here today to take something that isn't ours," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential, earnest tone. "We are here to protect Arthur's legacy. We are here to do what he was no longer capable of doing for himself. We are asking you, as his friends, as his partners, to step in, to do the right thing, to honor the real Arthur." She sat down. The silence was deafening. It was brilliant. She had played the part she was born for. She wasn't just a victim, she was a savior. The board members looked at her with sympathy. A few even nodded, their faces full of concern. They had bought it. Every last word. And then, every single person in that room turned their eyes to me. David Chen, sitting at the end of the table, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was my turn. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there, in the silence, and let her performance hang in the air for a moment. Then, I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop and a small USB drive. "That was a beautiful story, Karen," I said, my voice perfectly level as I plugged the drive into the table's console. The large projector screen at the end of the room hummed to life. But as a journalist, I've learned it's always best to check the facts. Karen's smile wavered. Mark looked confused. "You've built your case on 2 points," I said, addressing the board. "Not my parents. 1, that my grandfather, Arthur, was mentally incompetent for the last 5 years. And 2, that I am an unfit, gold-digging child trying to liquidate his legacy." The first slide appeared on the screen. It was a stock ticker. "This is a trade Arthur executed 8 months ago," I said. Against the advice of his broker, it yielded a 20% return in a flat market. The next slide. I clicked. Is his handwritten markup on a manuscript from 6 months ago. His notes are, as you all know, sharper than any editor in this building. I clicked again. A copy of a scathing, brilliant letter. And this is his legal correspondence from 3 months before he died, threatening a lawsuit against a rival for breach of contract. This is not the work of a senile man. The board members were leaning forward, So, we've established his competence. Now let's address my motive. Let's talk about the money. The next slide was a single number: $1,600,000. This is the amount Arthur paid to Karen and Mark over 30 years. I said. Karen scoffed, finding her voice. That was a gift from a loving father. Was it? I said, my voice dropping. Because the gift stopped exactly 3 years ago. The next slide showed the bank statement, the last official payment. And then, nothing. He cut you off. I said. The room was tomb quiet. But you didn't stop. Did you? I clicked. On the screen, in high resolution, was the first forged check. The one for $20,000. And next to it, a copy of Arthur's real, verified signature from his passport. They weren't even close. This is Arthur's signature, I said, pointing to the real one. And this is a crime. I clicked again. The second check. Click. The third. Click. The fourth. All 12 of them. One after another. A parade of their arrogance and their fraud. $250,000. Stolen. I watched my mother's face. The mask of the grieving victim didn't just crack, it shattered. Underneath was pure, ugly panic. Mark looked like he was going to be physically sick. He wasn't senile. I said, my voice like steel. He was done. He was done with the excuses. Done with the failures. And done with the theft. You didn't prey on a senile old man. You stole from a lion. And you assumed I was too stupid. Or too sentimental. To ever find out. I turned to the board. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a long-form robbery. My parents aren't here to protect a legacy. They're here to finish a heist. It was over. I didn't even have to ask for a vote. David Chen stood up. The documents you are seeing, he said to the board, have already been verified by our legal team and forwarded to the district attorney's office. Karen let out a small, strangled sound. Security, David said, pressing a button on the console. The doors opened. 2 uniformed guards walked in. They didn't look confused. They walked straight to Mark and Karen. You can't do this, Mark yelled. Finding his voice? We're his family. No, I said, standing up at last. You're not. Karen looked at me. Her eyes finally wide, with the terror of a cornered animal. Nancy. Please. Don't let them do this. I'm your mother. I looked at the woman who had abandoned me, lied to me, and accused me of theft after stealing from the only man who ever loved me. I just shook my head. You're not my mother. You're just a bad story. And I'm the editor. I watched them being led out of the room, out of the building, and out of my life. 3 months later, I sat in that same leather chair in Arthur's library. It was my office now. The legal mess was settled. The scandal had died down. My editorial team was gathered, waiting for my first major announcement as the new editor-in-chief. Module E5. The Loopbreaker Vow. My grandfather built this house by finding voices. I told them. By taking a chance on people who had a story to tell. His first act as an editor was to publish a brilliant young author everyone else had rejected. A woman named Eleanor. I looked around the room. In that spirit. My first official act is to announce the Eleanor and Arthur Fund. From now on, 10% of this company's profits will be dedicated to a new imprint. An imprint for first-time authors. Specifically, authors with no agent, no connections, and no platform. We will find the people no one else is looking for. We will build the voices no one else is listening to. It wasn't just a win. It was a new beginning. I took their corruption, their greed, and their selfishness, and I forged it into a new legacy. Not just his legacy. Ours.